So, you want to hear another story, huh?
Hey everyone, it's Kados here from the Game Maze channel, bringing another episode of Press X to Tutorial. Today we'll be looking at Borderlands 2 and what design elements the developers implemented in the early stages of the game. Since this is a sequel, we'll also be looking at the changes, which are mostly improvements, in Borderlands 2 as compared to the original Borderlands. First up, let's look at the intro cinematic. It has quite a lot of familiarities to the original Borderlands, however there are quite a few changes. It begins with Marcus conducting a monologue, with various lightly animated artwork being played out on screen. This is a bit reminiscent of the opening to Mad Max, or as some of you viewers may know it as, The Road Warrior. However, it also seems to have taken some inspiration from classic role-playing games. In fact, this game takes a lot of inspiration from various other games, films, and pop culture in general. Borrowing so much, but being so original is really quite amazing. Also note how the iridium, which Borderlands 2 players will know, is quite prominent with having this distinct purple colour, highlighting that is highly important throughout the game. With the monologue over, we now begin with the opening cutscene, once more playing very similar to the original. We can now expect from this game a very similar experience to the original, however in a subtle way they tell us that this is going to be even bigger and better. In the original, the protagonists are on board a bus. However, in this game, they are now instead on a train. And fast forwarding to Borderlands the pre-sequel, it begins on a rocket. The advancements in technology in the intro do a semi-subtle way of showing advancements in the actual game series. Now, an issue with the first Borderlands, which you can now see on screen, is that the opening cinematic did little to show how the various characters could or should be played. We saw Lilith had some sort of blink, and we could guess by the character design that Brick would be a tank. However, we had little info until we actually began the game. In fact, we would have to wait until level 5 to unlock their special ability. This meant you had invested a fair amount of time already, and if you were to re-roll, that time would be subjectively wasted. Although this is somewhat common in RPGs, there are ways to mitigate this issue. One of the first improvements we see here is that the characters actually utilise their skills during the opening cutscene. We now have a much clearer idea of how these particular characters will act and their special abilities simply by us previewing them prior to the character creation. While we are discussing character introductions, let's take a look at what is happening on screen right now. Notice how the game pauses and a title with a description is splashed up on the screen. This is known as a boss subtitle, or in this case a character subtitle. This lends to what many consider to be a grindhouse feel of the game. In fact, boss subtitles have appeared in many games, such as the Legend of Zelda and Metal Gear Solid franchises, but also in films, such as The Good, The Bad and The Ugly. They originated from old Chinese kung fu films. In their usage, they help the player, or viewer, to quickly learn about the character and to show that they are of importance. Also interesting to note is that this game gives us much better goals or objectives early on. From the opening monologue, we know it is about finding a new vault. However, from the cinematic, we now have a major antagonist, Handsome Jack, which the first game was lacking. I won't go into too much details in this video, but a protagonist helps greatly with providing motivation to continue through the story. Overall, this intro video does a very good job for hyping us up for the upcoming game experience. There is action, some comedy, we meet the cast of characters, and we are given an antagonist. We now should be very excited to get into the actual game itself and start playing. However, here's actually what I consider to be a fault in the early part of the game. The character creation menu just seems very lackluster. We choose the character we're going to play, as well as go through some customization options, but the longer we do this, the less effective the hype that we had built up earlier is. And the background is this rather dull greyish sort of colour. It's not very appealing. It would have been much more interesting if it were like the first Borderlands, where you selected them from a group during a cutscene, or perhaps they had wanted posters, or even just some more personality. For this video, we'll be playing as Salvador the Gunzerker for Borderlands 2, and Lilith the Siren for the original Borderlands. So now here the game actually begins. We are introduced to Claptrap, who for the tutorial acts as a sort of guide, provides some comedic relief, and helps drive the plot. This is also a throwback to the original Borderlands, where it was a very similar experience.
Wait a minute! You're not dead! Yes! Now I can get off this glacier! Claptrap, your metaphorical ship has finally come in! Allow me to introduce myself. I am a CL4P TP steward bot. but my friends call me Claptrap. Or they would if any of them were still alive.
Claptrap introduces us to the elements in the HUD. Note how rather than explain what every single thing means, it displays it promptly on screen, albeit behind subtitles, with a quick explanation of it, and then places it where it should normally be located. The game doesn't waste our time giving drawn out explanation of these elements. This game expects you to be familiar with the common elements from RPGs, such as health and XP bars, as well as the map from other modern games. The developers didn't need to over-explain basic things, because it expects its fan base will already know all of this. A good game will be able to identify who it is targeted for and be able to best accommodate the experience towards them. And this is a very good indicator. Also look at how the UI only includes the things relevant to us right now. There is no shield bar, no ammo info, no special ability icon, etc. The game will instead introduce these when they are more relevant, allowing us to better understand the current information being displayed on screen rather than being overwhelmed. Speaking of health bars, after the train wreck in the initial cutscene, we can see that we are quite injured. At this stage, our health doesn't automatically regenerate like in a lot of other modern shooters, so it teaches us that we need to find an alternative to healing, which will be the classic health pack, or in this game health vials. We'll follow up with this later. We follow Claptrap inside, and here Knuckle Dragger steals Claptrap's eye. For reasons. Claptrap informs us to loot a gun. Here we're introduced to quests, an obvious important element in an RPG. To do so, we need to go over to the cabinet and loot it. Press X to loot. We have learnt that we can loot various things for items and cash. This is where we also get some health vials, so we learn this is what can heal us and how we can find them. Looting is a massive thing in the Borderlands series. In the first game, however, we start with a gun and we aren't introduced to looting until later on in the game, so it seems Borderlands 2 does a much more effective way of teaching this to us. Now before we follow Claptrap, we can do a bit of exploring. If we go over here and open this up, we discover one of the secret Vault Hunter symbols, which triggers our first badass rank up, which we won't discuss in this video. What this teaches the player early on is to pay attention and to explore their environments, which will pay off later in the game as they will find secrets, chests and other goodies. Also, it is good they didn't give a new item reward, such as a new gun, because as mentioned earlier, the game wants to keep control over when these new elements are introduced. We still get rewarded for exploring and discovery, but it doesn't break the already assigned early game flow. Skipping ahead, we are now given non-intrusive instructions on how to aim, shoot and perform a melee attack. Obviously these are quite essential in a first person shooter, but we are told them out of combat, so we aren't fully stressed by having them pop up only when in combat. Some may argue that this also spoils that there will be an encounter ahead, and they would be right. This is where the developers need to weigh up which option to choose that will result in a better overall experience. We'll put these new skills into practice shortly. Just to cut back to the first Borderlands, they instruct us on how to perform a melee attack against enemies with guns, shooting at us at a very inappropriate time. So that's an immediate improvement we can see in Borderlands 2. As we follow Claptrap, he bumps into one of those snowdrift things. Destroying it now pops some more items, once more teaching us that we can obtain loot through a variety of sources. It comes immediately after we have been told how to shoot, so we can replenish our ammunition if we need to. Claptrap almost runs into a second snowdrift, but doesn't. This prompts us to perform a melee attack on it. It doesn't force us to, but it's a subtle reinforcer for us to learn about our melee skill and actually put it into practice. We now have our first encounter, a run-in with these bullymongs, or monglets to be precise. They visually look a lot similar to the Knuckle Dragger, who we were introduced to earlier, so visual familiarity plays a role. Also, please note how the enemies initially appear in one position, but later attack us from multiple sides, when we have to learn how to aim horizontally. As we move on, there are a lot of chests and snowdrifts that we can acquire items from, and they are very prominent in their placement and contrast well with the snowy background. In the original, the small safes and other lootable items sort of blended in with the junkyard setting. The green lights were an indicator that they were lootable, however this does a much better job. In our next encounter, we now fight these monglets from a much further distance, helping us to work on our aim a bit, and with that we need to shoot them in a vertical manner. However, a couple of later ones also come down from the side, and so we have to instead aim at them horizontally, further refining our aiming skills. I feel these Bullymongs are a much better introductory enemy than the bandits from the first game, firstly because they tend to run towards us, which makes them easier to hit as they get closer. And finally, a stronger Brat Bullymong finishes this encounter, ramping up the challenge, letting us know that there are different classes of enemies, and it prepares us for the upcoming boss fight. When we do incur damage from them, it is telegraphed a lot better. We can now understand a lot better the source of where the damage is coming from, the amount of damage we incur from a single hit, as well as the initial targets being a lot easier to identify and attack. These two encounters alone provide a great deal of variety. To juxtapose this, the bandits fought initially in the first Borderlands are physically located on the same plane as us, and they tend to duck behind cover, making them harder to hit. And the initial encounters didn't provide as much variety, and we only learned to shoot horizontally, not vertically as well. We now encounter Knuckle Dragger. We are once more prompted with a boss subtitle, signifying the importance of this enemy, and that this will be a bigger challenge than our previous encounters. During the encounter, we have to fight a wave of minions, which is common in Borderlands boss fights. Upon defeating Knuckle Dragger, we are rather abruptly given a message on screen informing us we have leveled up and the details of such. Now, I think this was a bit poorly timed, instead they could have shown it after complete the upcoming quest. Note that the message has a delay, so you don't accidentally miss it. That's a very good idea. However, this message I feel is really jarring and doesn't lend well to the pace of the overall encounter. So we've almost finished the tutorial, and I'd like to conclude that it actually feels like we've accomplished something. Going back to the original Borderlands, there was no boss encounter to conclude with. Actually, I'm not entirely sure if in the original, if reaching the town, or perhaps after the bandits raid the town, that it actually feels like the tutorial is over. Now, throughout gaming, we've had the boss encounter, a test of our skills learned up to that point. They are very useful to the pacing of the game, for creating high or intense points, as well as giving us a real sense of achievement when they have been defeated, which leads us to continue playing and to become more immersed within the experience. Although this was just a tutorial section, we feel as if we have actually accomplished something, and the aforementioned level up, although jarring, helps add to this feeling.
And open!
And in Borderlands, accomplishment is rewarded with loot, and this sort of weans us into our typical Borderlands 2 dungeon, and I use the term loosely, functions. Go through the stage, beat all the encounters, kill the boss, and be rewarded with a final chest at the end. Now, the original Borderlands introduction is not bad by any means, and does a fairly reasonable job introducing us to the game, but even the opening cinematic and tutorial alone shows how much the sequel has improved. This is further carried on by displaying the appropriate game commands in a better timed manner, better initial encounters, and by making the whole tutorial feel very satisfying by ending with a boss battle, a level up, and an exciting new weapon to use. And with that, this episode of Press X2 Tutorial has finished. Thank you for watching. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Press X2 Tutorial. To see future episodes, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments any particular games you think would make a good episode. Also, check out our previous episode on Rayman Origins if you haven't yet. Alternatively, check out our Critique Hit episode on Sonic and All Stars Racing Transformed. This is Kados, logging out.